this is Dr. Olivia Carril, who lives in Santa Fe. She is up here in Taos because she's doing collections of bees with a contract with the BLM in the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, because a survey had never ever been done. Very few surveys of New Mexico bees have been done, native bees. And so she's been doing that, started 2 summers ago. And then last summer, this summer, and we'll probably go into next year. So she'll probably, maybe. So she comes up at least once a month and does have somebody else here helping out on working with her. So, Olivia, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you all for coming. I love seeing so many people so excited to learn something about bees. At least I assume that's why you're here. Your obligation to come because Jan's so awesome. But this is how I spent today. This is how I spend most of my days all summer long. Sometimes I have a kid beside me. They're usually a little more thrilled than that, but someday she's going to be an awesome bee collector. These are the tools of my trade. This is my bee net. It's a golf club handle. You can see here. A little bit of wedding veil material works pretty good, and then a little bit of that thicker canvas duck around a piano wire. This is piano wire that holds it all together. And I collect bees with this, and every bee that I collect gets put into a little vial. These are the vials, and many of these have the bees that I collected today. I haven't had a chance to pin them. But inside here, this white powder at the bottom is actually cyanide. And then over the top is some chromatograph filter paper that's rolled up really tightly so that the crystals can't get through, but the fumes can. And it creates a tiny little chamber that euthanizes the bee in about 2 or 3 seconds. And the reason is that in order to identify different species of bees, and you'll see what I'm talking about here in a minute, you have to have them hold still and be on a pin. And in order for other people to believe that you actually saw it, you have to say, see, here it is, this is the one. I've been doing this for over 20 years now. I've had the chance to work in Grand Staircase, Escalante National Monument, and Pinnacles, and Nevada, and Yosemite, and Zion, and Greece, all sorts of amazing places. And even after all that time, I still find what I do absolutely fascinating. And one of the really cool things about it is that when you look at your collections, everything that's in one of these vials gets pinned up together. They all end up together in your little box full of bees for the day. And you can start to see patterns right away because each of these vials represents a unique flower. All of the ones from the same flower end up together. All of the ones from the same location, the same time of day. And so before any Excel spreadsheets or any fancy statistical analysis has been done, I can see patterns, and I can see that all of this kind of bee was on this kind of flower, and I can see that these ones were out early in the year, but were gone by later in the year. And I find it absolutely fascinating. I have a box full of what we've collected so far this year up here. Feel free to come up and take a look afterwards. It's kind of amazing. A few years ago, I took a break from doing bee surveys, and my co-author, Joe Wilson, and I wrote this book, The Bees in Your Backyard, which will teach you a lot about identifying most of the bee genera that are found in North America. But more important on here, and we can come back, take a picture, whatever, if you ever have a picture of a bee, or you have a question about a bee and you'd like information, feel free to reach out to us. We check our email all the time. We respond to people on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of those fancy places. So feel free, if you have questions that don't get answered tonight, to reach out to us. So part of the reason that I'm up here doing this in New Mexico is because there are so many different kinds of bees here. We think there are around between 20 and 30,000 species in the world. We're still finding new species, so this number is in flux. Also, we have certain kinds of scientists that are called lumpers that will take a whole bunch of things that might seem different and put them all together. And then a PhD student will come along that needs to do something, and they'll split them back apart so the numbers change as the names change. I think this happens in plants too, pretty similar. In the US, there's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 species. And in New Mexico, we estimate there's somewhere between 900 and 1,100. So how does that compare to the rest of the United States? if you look, pretty much, so here's numbers of species that we know for each state. And again, these numbers change a lot. In fact, I learned just last week that my number on Virginia is wrong. I was corrected by someone who told me there's more there. So, but generally speaking, east of the Mississippi River here, we have about 770 bee species. You can see that there are several states in the west that have more than everything east of the Mississippi River. California kind of takes the cake with about twice what the eastern U.S. has, and that's because they have a huge elevational gradient from Death Valley up to, what is it, Mount Whitney? High peaks. North to south, there's a huge latitudinal gradient. They have a Mediterranean climate all the way up to alpine environments, and that's a lot of habitats for different kinds of bees. And that's a really long flowering season too, which helps. New Mexico's not doing bad though. Arizona and New Mexico are the same. And the gist of this is pretty much that if you want to study butterflies or beetles or even birds, you go to the tropics. If you want to study bees, you go to the deserts. Deserts are the places where bees are found, and this is true around the world. So what do we know about New Mexico bees? Not very much, really. So I went through the database. There's a database run by the USDA, actually, out of Logan, Utah. And they have about 2 million bee specimens in this place, and most of them have been entered into a computer so that you can look through and filter for just New Mexico bees, etc. And I went through and looked for all of the records by county in New Mexico. And pretty much the places where we know quite a bit are areas where there's a university. The Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge here, we know quite a bit. Up in the Four Corners region, there's a bunch of threatened and endangered plants, and the bees that visit those have been studied. Down here, just across the border in Portal, Arizona, is the Southwest Research Station, which is run by the American Museum of Natural History. And every fall, August, late summer, they sponsor a bee course, and people that want to learn a lot about bees go down there. And so we know quite a bit about the bees of that area from the collections of the students. Over here is Carlsbad Caverns. They did a bee study not that long ago, and so most of the records that we have are from there. But for the rest of the state, it really hasn't been sampled. So prior to my work up here, which started in 2016, 34 species have been recorded for Rio Arriba, 28 for Taos County. We know there's a lot more than that. I could list off what I think would be here in my head and feel pretty confident about it. But no one had taken the time to take a net and some vials and go out and collect those so that we could document their presence. Los Alamos, 2 bee species have been recorded from there. So we've got our work cut out for us in New Mexico, and as a bee scientist, it's a pretty fun place to be because there's a lot of new discoveries to be made every summer. I'm currently doing a study in Bandelier National Monument, just so you know kind of what's going on in New Mexico bee-wise. This is my second year of collecting bees out there. I'm looking to see how the burns that have gone through Bandelier might be affecting the bees. It turns out the bees kind of like that disturbance because it opened up the overstory and all of those dense trees, and there's a lot more herbaceous flowering stuff underneath, and the bees are pretty happy about that. And then I set up a series of plots that are 1 hectare in size. In there, 1 hectare is about 100 meters by 100 meters. And I collect those in the same way, so it's a systematic collection, and I do it every month, so that over time we would be able to say with a pretty good degree of certainty whether bee populations in these areas are increasing or decreasing, which bees might be changing in population, which ones are stable. And I'm doing the same thing here in the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument. This is my 3rd summer of intense collecting here. I did a little before that. These are the current locations from 2 years, from 2017 and 2018 bee collections. And we have 2 goals here really. The first one is just to document how many bees are here, what plants they're visiting a lot, what time of year peak bee diversity is happening. But I also have a series of those standardized plots, just like in Bandelier setup. They're even the same size, so I could compare between Rio Grande and Bandelier. I can compare within my plots within Rio Grande. And I have a plot that's, I have an ungrazed and a grazed plot. I have a sagebrush and two sagebrush plots, one grazed and one ungrazed. I have a burned and an unburned plot in pinyon juniper, and then I have a riparian plot. So I might be able to kind of assess how some of these big landscape sort of level effects influence bees. So this is how I spend, this is what I did today. This was just barely, this is what I do. Here's just for fun. This is one of the coolest discoveries last year, right outside the visitor center in the Wild Rivers. There was a mint blooming in a little crack in the asphalt, and this bee was on that mint. And this is the first record this far north for this particular bee. It's called centris. When they're alive, their eyes are red like this. It's the most amazing thing to see, and they're big, and they hover in the air. They're very noticeable. And very hard to catch, I might add. Just downstream, outside of Pilar, we caught this bee. This is Ericrosis. Ericrosis is a parasite on that centris. So when you find the Ericrosis, the centris has to be in the vicinity. And what it does is it sneaks into the nest of the centris. The centris mother is gathering pollen to bring back for her offspring. The Ericrosis will sneak into that nest when she's not home and lay an egg kind of hidden behind the pollen mound where it can't be seen. The eggs are insanely small. And that little egg hatches, and the larvae has these giant mandibles on it, and it snips the other bee in half. I know. And then it eats the pollen that had been left there for the host offspring instead. So it's not a predator. It doesn't eat the bee, but it does eat the pollen that was left for the bee. So sometimes these kind of bees are called cuckoo bees because they're similar to the cuckoo bird. You guys know that story. So I don't know how much you already know about bees, but maybe you're getting the sense that they're not all like the honeybee. A lot of people think of the honeybee when they hear the word bee, and this is and all of the characteristics that go along with this is what comes to your mind. You're thinking they make honey and they have hives and there's a queen. But it turns out the honeybee is kind of the black sheep of the bee world. And really not a very good representative of the majority of the bees that we find in North America. It's pretty different. First of all, you may or may not know that the honeybee is not native to North America. It came over about 400 years ago, twice actually. It came up with the Spaniards from Mexico, and it also came east across the ocean into New England. It was brought over as a pollinator, it was brought over for its honey, but it's not, in the near past, it's not native to this country. So let me introduce you to a bee that's a little more typical of what we find around here. This is a mining bee. I caught so many of these today. They're out in great abundance. And there's about, let's see, in the east, in North America, 400 species or so of these guys, maybe more. They're incredibly abundant. There's a lot of Andrena species. And they all nest in the ground, so they don't nest in hives. And they're solitary. So each individual female digs a hole in the ground. Inside that she'll create little tiny chambers. Sometimes they'll be gregarious and they'll build in proximity to other people or other bees. In the same way that people like to live in close proximity to each other in neighborhoods, bees will do the same thing and set up shop next to each other. But each one of the holes into the ground is an individual bee working by herself. We can look inside these nests. The way scientists usually do this is they get a little bit of chalk dust and a straw, and they fill the straw with chalk dust and then blow it into the hole on the surface of the ground. Turns a little bit white like that. And then they can follow that chalk dust trail down the tunnel that the bee has dug. And at the bottom you usually find a series of little tiny chambers, and each one of those will have a ball of pollen set in it, and one egg will be laid on top. So each of these is a little nursery for one bee baby who grows up by herself in that little nest. Here's an interesting example of one kind of mining bee. This one was found in South Central Utah. My mentor, Terry Griswold, he gave me my start studying bees quite a while ago. Found a congregation of these bees all nesting together, and it was something that we didn't know much about, and so he started digging, and he started with a trowel but had to switch to a shovel pretty quickly, and it took him all day with the help of friends to get to the bottom of this nest, which was 9 feet underground.
Wow.
9 feet. The bee is about 1/3 of an inch in size. This probably isn't typical. The thought is that maybe nesting habitat, the right substrate to build a nest in, was hard to come by there, and so successive generations of bees had continued to use the same holes and expand them down. More typically, bee nests are probably between 6 inches and a foot below the ground. So let me show you a video of a bee building her nest. This is a little bee. It's called a mallow bee. They come out here. You'll see a lot of them. Sometimes their nests, when they're finished, have a little tiny chimney on top, just a little tiny straw made out of dirt. You can see her using her front legs to press the earth to get it shaped just the way she wants. She uses her face to press on the earth, and she uses those mandibles to really chew and chew. She's in the middle of a road that's traveled by hundreds of cars all the time. That's the favorite spot. That's true for those little mallow bees quite commonly. Okay, let's go forward. Here we go. So in addition to nesting in the ground, about 70% of bees in North America nest in the ground. The other 30 or so percent nest in twigs or in beetle burrows that have been made in an old piece of wood or in snail shells, all sorts of different pre-existing cavities, but the good majority, especially here in New Mexico, nest in the ground. And it could be that the reason that bee diversity is so high here has something to do with our nice dry soil, which probably isn't a great place for fungus to grow or other things that might impact bees in the east, and that might be part of it. So when we think of the honeybee, we think of a bee that you usually see sometime from February all the way through November. In Albuquerque, they're out for almost the entire year. And so it gives the sense that bees are these long-lived things that occur for an entire year. And that's really not the case for most of bees. So let me walk you through a more typical life cycle for a bee. And this again is a mining bee. These guys emerge in the early spring. But some bees emerge in the summer. There are fall bees, so we could shift this whole cycle down if we wanted to. But the general gist is, the bee emerges, they pop out of the ground, they dig their way back out from their little nest. Males usually come out first, followed by the females, and as soon as the females come out, they begin foraging, gathering pollen off of flowers, building their nests. They're mated almost instantly upon emerging from the ground. But by maybe 6 to 9 weeks later, that adult that emerged that spring is dead. She's gone. She's laid all the eggs she'll lay in her life, and she is no more. And she'll never meet all of her offspring that are in the nest. They'll come out after developing in the earth for about 9 months. They'll emerge the following year to start the cycle over again. So for this reason, because those little offspring are in the nest eating the pollen that the mother left there for them, they don't really need honey. There's no need for honey because this isn't a perennial colony that will continue from year to year. They don't need to get through the winter as adults the way that honeybees do. And so no need for those canned flowers, which is kind of what honey is. So I think I inhaled a bee today. Most bees are solitary, right? So each female builds her own nest. She gathers all of the pollen that she needs by herself. There's no workers helping her. She is the queen and the worker both. She lays the eggs. Usually the nest that she builds is in the ground, but it might be in twigs or holes in pieces of wood. The only true hive bee in North America is the honeybee. Bumblebees form colonies, but the colony is annual, so it's rebuilt from scratch every year by a new queen. She starts over. And they may be between 100 and 300 individuals, whereas a honeybee colony can have up to 10,000 bees living in it. Many of these are specialists, and I'm going to talk about that at great length here in a minute. But also, only the honeybee makes the honey. So here's a day in the life of a bee, just So you can see this is a specialist. This is a bee that only collects pollen from a certain kind of flower. In this case, it's a squash bee. The genus is Pollinators, and it only collects pollen from squash flowers early in the morning. She's got pollen all over her body, so she scrapes it off of her tongue, off of her eyes and her antenna. She even has a special structure on her leg that pulls the pollen off. She puts it onto her mid-legs from her forelegs, and from her mid-legs she'll put it onto her hind legs, where she has special pollen collecting hairs to carry it back to the nest. That's a male. She is not interested. She's kicking him off. And that cycle is repeated from flower to flower all day long. That is the life of a bee, summed up quickly. So the diversity in floral form and color and scent that we see throughout the world in almost every ecoregion is a result pretty much of the relationship between bees and some other pollinators, bees being the major ones, and all of these flowers and the coevolution of them as they communicate with each other in different ways. The reason that we think of bees so often is really because of their role as pollinators. That's kind of why they've come to the forefront. A lot of the pollination of orchards and some of these other really big crops that we have is done by honeybees, because we can take 10,000 of them at once and plop them down in the middle somewhere. We can't really do that with native bees. They're nesting in the ground, they're nesting individually, it's hard to do that. But nonetheless, in natural habitats, they're still one of the most important pollinators of angiosperms today. And this relationship between bees and flowers has been co-evolving. They have been working together through this sort of this love-hate relationship, really, for between 70 and 130 million years. It's been happening for a really long time. It's led to a lot of amazing, amazing-looking flowers and some pretty amazing strategies on the parts of the bees. So let's talk about this from the point of view of the flower just for a minute. If you're a flower, the goal, of course, is to make seeds, and that happens when pollen moves from your anthers, hopefully to the stigma of another flower, the female portion of another flower. And the pollen grains end up down inside and fertilize the ovaries, etc., seeds are made. That's a little hard to do when you're stuck in the ground and can't move. So you need help from someone. You need a vector to move the pollen to someone else. It's usually not a good idea to self-fertilize. Some plants can do it, but most try not to. This can be done by wind, but in order for that to be successful, you have to create a lot of pollen, knowing that a lot of it will be wasted and lost and stuck up people's noses causing allergies and not of any use. So another way is to involve an animal pollinator, some sort of vector that's a little more invested in seeing more invested in moving from flower to flower. So this is tricky for a flower, though. If you think about it, there's a lot of things that are flowering all at once. And the strategy is to try to get that bee to move pollen that's on its body from a flower that is like you to another flower that is like you, right? So moving pollen from a cactus flower to a mallow flower does nobody any good. And this is where all of the manipulations that flowers have come into play. It's important to remember that not all bees are good pollinators. Some of them, the bee could care less, honestly, if the flower gets pollinated. Its objective is to get as many pollen grains as possible back to the nest, because every pollen grain that goes back there feeds a baby, and that's a big deal to a mama bee. On the other hand, every pollen grain that ends up in a bee's nest didn't pollinate a flower, so that's a loss almost from the point of view of a flower. So there's this push-pull that's happening between the two of them. They need each other, but they also need to get what they want out of the relationship. So here's an example of a bee that's not necessarily a good pollinator. This little bee is called Hyleus. Sometimes it's called the yellow-faced bee. And it's the only bee in North America that does this, but rather than collect pollen on hairs on its legs, the female actually eats the pollen and stores it in her crop and regurgitates it back at the nest. And so any pollen that she happens to get on her body is probably internal, and she's not going to do very good at dropping pollen grains off somewhere else. Here's another example. This is a carpenter bee. They don't occur up in Taos, but you can find them rarely in Santa Fe, but pretty commonly in Albuquerque and south from there. And this bee is too big to fit inside the corolla tube on that flower. So instead, she goes to the back and bites a little hole. Right here, she'll make a little hole and then stick her tongue in there, and she can suck the nectar out of the back of the plant without having to go through the trouble of pushing her way through this narrow little tube.
Is that honeysuckle?
Uh-huh. The problem with this is once she's pulled all of the nectar out of the flower, she's taken away the reward for any other bee that might visit. So she's made it so this flower is less attractive to all the bees that might visit it. Another example here, here's two bees. This one's the honeybee over here. This one's a little tiny perdita. Sometimes they're called fairy bees. And these bees are often so small that on any one trip to collect pollen, they don't also come in contact with the stigma because they're so little, they don't come in contact with both. And she's really only interested in the part where the anthers are. So, plants have to manipulate bees in order to get what they want out of the relationship. And it's led to an incredible diversity in floral form that we see. So let's talk about how the flower might make this work to its benefit. Step one is to offer a reward for visiting. You have to bring them in. You have to advertise the presence of something good. And you have to offer a reward for having come to visit. It's like when you go to the grocery store on the weekend and they have the little snacks that you get for free. Same idea. You need a reward. How bees see flowers is a little bit different from how humans see flowers. This is the range of colors that our eyes pick up on. Bees see the same range, but shifted down just a little bit. So they don't see well in the red area. Most of the red flowers that we have around here, they may be visited. It's not that they're invisible. They're just not big and attractive to bees in the red range. Whereas they see colors that our eyes don't even pick up on. So what they see coming off of a flower is probably pretty different than what we see when we look at the same flowers. Here's a couple pictures just to show you. These are kind of incredible. That was how we see it, and this is what a bee would see. So here is sort of a bullseye effect leading the way down to where the nectar and pollen are there in the middle. Here's another. This is a ranunculus, and this is how a bee would see that same flower. In addition to the color for advertising, they also advertise with scent. So a bee smells a flower using its antenna. On the antenna are a whole bunch of little tiny receptors that grab onto different molecules that are floating around in the air and send a signal to the brain, hopefully saying that there's a good flower somewhere nearby. Some of these, believe it or not, you're familiar with. Benzaldehyde attracts a lot of different pollinators. It's pretty common out there. And it's also in your fridge. If you have almond extract in your fridge, the exact same thing. It smells just like that. Alpha-farnesene is one that's produced that potentially draws in certain specialist bees and a couple different pollination systems out there. And then beta-ocimene is a really common one. It's been found to attract bees that specialize on willow, but it's actually found in a lot of different flowers in addition to just willow. So if you want to manipulate bees, here's a couple of the strategies that are pretty commonly seen. One is limiting the number of bee visitors, and I'll talk about that in more detail here in a second. Another is to alter the bee's behavior. Limiting those nectar robbers can be kind of important if you can find a way to kind of manipulate the ones that are stealing from you. Pretending to be a bee, and finally hoping for specialist bees. And I'll end with that and talk quite a bit about those. So one way to limit the number of bees is to bloom at a time of day when very little else is in bloom. So if you can bloom really early in the morning, this benefits the bee because there's no competition for the pollen and nectar that are there. And it benefits you because there's no possibility of mixing pollens from different plants. So this is what happens in the case of the squash bees. Another example that's really common, I live in Santa Fe, and right now going gangbusters is the evening primrose, the Enothera, and they bloom, where I am, they bloom right at dusk. And there's a bee that comes out in the evening. It has these giant, bees have 5 eyes. They have 2 big ones on the sides and 3 little ones on the top. And the little ones sense light, and the bee that visits the evening primrose has gigantic eyes on the top of its head so that it can see better in the dark. So that's a way to sort of limit the number of visitors. Another way is to have a small flower. If you constrict the flower so that only bees that are quite small can visit, you've limited the population size, so to speak, and maybe increase the chances that only small flowers are visited by small bees. Another thing that's been observed is the case of some, you guys know this flower, astragalus? Common name milkfetch, is that right? Some of these, not all of them, but some of them produce a nectar that's a little intoxicating, so to speak. And they've found that bees that visit these flowers and drink that nectar tend to not groom themselves as well. And so the pollen doesn't end up packed into the legs where it's not accessible to the stigma on the next flower. They still have pollen all over their bodies as they move from flower to flower. And it's thought that this might increase the chances of pollination. As far as the nectar robbers, this is Ipomopsis. What's the common name? Skyrocket or something?
Scarlet Gilia.
Scarlet Gilia, okay. And these guys have two potential visitors. They have the hummingbirds, and then they have these big bees. Big bees will come to steal the nectar because there's a lot of nectar in there, because the nectar is meant for hummingbirds, right? So there would be more for a larger animal. And one thing that these plants can do is if they have enough visits that are robber visits where no pollination is happening, the nectar becomes thicker, more viscous, so the hummingbird is still attracted to it, but it's less appealing to the bee. So they can actually regulate even after they've bloomed. Another option, and I worked in Greece for a while on bees, and I saw this. It was the coolest thing because it really does look like a bee, is to pretend you're a bee. Some of these flowers will go to great lengths to have little wings sticking out, and to a bee that's buzzing by really quickly, it appears to be a bee. They even put off scents that smell like the sexual pheromones of a female bee. And the male bees are the ones that do most of the pollinating here. They'll sneak into or dive onto the flower, get covered in pollen, be disappointed, and fly on and try again somewhere else.
Is that an orchid?
Yeah, it is.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Genus Ophrys.
Oh, wow, that's great.
Yeah. And the last way, of course, is to hope for specialists. Specialist bees are a bit of an enigma. They're kind of fascinating. What's the point of specializing? Because once you've decided you're only going to visit one kind of flower, if that flower doesn't come up, maybe you're in trouble. So this has fascinated me for a long time, and it's actually what I focused on for my PhD. So for the last little bit here, I'm going to walk you through some of what I did for my PhD project. But let me give you a little overview on sort of the specifics of a specialist bee. A specialist bee is one that only collects pollen from one kind of plant. Usually it's at the genus level, maybe at the family level. For example, maybe it only visits Helianthus, the true sunflower. Or maybe it specializes on Asteraceae and will visit anything in the sunflower family. This relationship is maintained between generations. You remember I told you that mother bees never meet their offspring. Those offspring still visit the same plants, even though they never met their mothers and learned from watching them. And it happens throughout the geographic range of the bee. So if a Diadasia is a specialist on a mallow here, it's also a specialist on a mallow in California and Nevada and Utah. And wherever you find that species, it's still a specialist. And it's usually only one way. So a specialist bee isn't always on a specialist flower. It's not this relationship that's just between one flower and one bee. Usually you find specialist bees on flowers that are visited by a wide array of both specialists and generalists. There are several studies that have been done on specialist bees, and this is a family tree. So we call it a phylogeny, but it's basically the relationship between a bunch of different bee species. So here's the names of the different bees, and the color indicates what flowers they visit. And the interesting thing to note on here is that somewhere in the past, some of these bees switched to visit a different kind of flower. So these bees in this group right here only visit Ranunculaceae. But somewhere in the past, they had to make that switch. Before that, they were visiting whatever this clade is visiting, the Campanulaceae. And we find this true in a lot of the bee groups where people have looked at which ones are specialists and generalists and on what. The plant families that the bees switch to when they switch as a family to something different are not really related to each other. So it doesn't, a bee doesn't necessarily become more generalist. It sometimes just stays specialist but switches the group that it's specializing on. So if we look at bees as a whole, look at the family tree for all of the different groups of bees. These are the bee families here. And what we see is the very first bees that ever occurred on Earth were probably specialist bees, because all of their predecessors, all of the current day representatives are specialists. What's more, the closest relative to them, the wasp, here, this is a wasp, from which they all evolved, was also still a specialist. So chances are good the first bees were specialists, and that somewhere along the line, some of them decided to become more generalist, whereas some maintained that specialization. Which suggests that generalization may have been the adaptive trait, the thing that bees move towards in order to become better in the world of flowers that they found themselves in. But the first bees, the ancestral, not technologically advanced option is the specialization. We also know, and this is kind of interesting, that if you take a bee that's, let's say, a specialist on a mint, and let's say it's nesting in a piece of a twig, so it's easy for you to open up that twig and see all the little babies with their pollen and manipulate them a little bit. If you take out the mint pollen associated with each of those little specialist babies and replace it with sunflower pollen, and then close the nest back up and wait to see what happens, those little baby bees will eat the sunflower pollen, develop with no problem whatsoever. They turn into perfectly healthy adult bees, but then go back to mint, even though just like their mothers did. So this suggests that perhaps they're hardwired to only recognize certain kinds of plants, and that specialization just means that they don't have the genes to recognize the diversity of things that are out there. They're just stuck on one thing. So with all of that background information, I decided to study this for a group of bees called Diadasia. And that cute little bee that was digging a nest that you were watching, that's this kind of bee. There's about 45 species. They're found in South America below the tropics and above the tropics, but not in the tropics, not between. And we know what each of the different species visits. Most of them are specialists on mallow. All of the ones in orange are specialists on mallow. One of them has switched to specialize on morning glories, just one species. And it's inside a group that all specializes on mallow. One of them has switched to specialize on something in the evening primrose family. About 5 or 6 have moved on to cactus and are now specialists on cactus. And these bees have been specialists on cactus long enough that they've gotten bigger. They're a bigger bee than the little mallow bees. And a couple of them, 2 separate times even, totally separate events, now specialize on sunflowers. So I looked at just the mallow and the cactus, but my question was really, of all of the plants that are blooming in the desert at the same time, why do they visit those ones? And back in time, when this bee's decided it's going to switch hosts. Why did it switch from mallow to cactus and not mallow to something else? What is it about cactus that seemed appealing even in the face of all of the other kinds of plants that might co-occur in an area? So here's an example of other things that co-bloom in the desert at the same time that mallow and cactus do. They're all very abundant. They're all perennial and bloom consistently from year to year, so seem like good host options to me. And they're visited by a lot of other bees, so I know they're popular. Why didn't the bee switch to something in that? I'll never actually know, but I might be able to get at some of the cues that are cluing in. I can't go back in time and see what made the bees decide to switch, but maybe I can get a sense of the more proximate causes for this. So I had this hypothesis that the reason that it switched from mallow to cactus was because they maybe smelled the same or looked the same, that maybe there was some similarity in the way these flowers presented to the bee that made them seem like a good option. So to test this, I headed out with a tiny vacuum cleaner and I sucked the scent off of flowers. It didn't actually look like that. It looked more like this. It's just a tiny little pump. I put the flowers inside almost a Ziploc bag, but with less sort of off-gassing. And then I'd hook it to a little tiny tube, and that tube was then hooked to my pump, my vacuum cleaner. And inside the tube was something very similar to like a charcoal, sort of an absorbent that would pull all of the scent out, and then I could rinse the scent molecules out of that absorbent and see what was in them. So I took all of those little tiny vials full of my scent compounds back to the lab, and I ran them through a fancy machine called a gas chromatograph coupled to a mass spectrometer. If anyone's ever watched NCIS and there's major mass spec, same thing. And pretty much what it does is it heats up my sample, and as it heats, because the molecules have different properties and they weigh different amounts and everything, they move through the tube that is the machine at different rates and come out at a different time. So then you can look at the time at which each of these molecules came out and figure out what they are. So what the scent is composed of based on when they come out. And I won't go into a detailed list of what I found or anything, but I looked at how similar they were to each other. And every time 2 points are close together, it means that the smell was similar. So looking just at the mallows here, the mallows kind of group together. All of the Malvaceae smell pretty similar to each other. This is Sphaerosia here in yellow. These are the, so this is the mallows at large, and includes Sedelcia and some of the other non-globe mallow plants. And then these are the globe mallows. So all of it kind of groups together nicely. 2 things were really separate, and this is rabbit brush, which the Diadasia, my little host specialist bee, doesn't visit, and it's pretty different in terms of the scent. And the same is true over here for prickly poppy. It has this wonderful, really strong scent, almost like nutmeg, and the bees don't visit it. Well, other bees visit it, but my bee doesn't, and it smells pretty different in terms of what compounds are inside it. But you'll notice there's a couple blue spots nested right within there. One of these is creosote. And I'm thinking that often when we smell creosote, what we're smelling is the foliage, and it could be the flower actually isn't that different, but the foliage is. And the other is a thistle. And interestingly, the few cases where a mallow bee has been found on a non-mallow plant, it's usually thistle. So maybe this is actually real and represents something. So after I have an idea of what scent compounds are in these flowers and how closely related they are to each other, I needed to then figure out how the bee scents these. Does the bee actually notice all of the compounds that are in there, or just a couple? My nose doesn't pick up on nearly as much stuff as my husband's. Which is probably why I had to change most of the diapers. The way you do this with the bees, you use something called an electroantennograph. It looks a little bit like this. And you take an antenna from a bee, you pluck it off the bee, and set it between 2 electrodes. And then you blow scent across that. And if the bee recognizes the compound that you're blowing across the bee antenna, it registers an electrical response. So you can see if a bee has the ability to recognize a compound. So I did this comparing a mallow bee to both its host plant and also that of a cactus bee that's in the same family, but something it doesn't visit. And then I reversed it and did it the other way. This is the results. So here is the scent of Sphaerosia. This is time running across here. And each time there's a peak, it means some compound, some scent molecule came through the machine. And when there's a blip, it suggests the bee is able to recognize that scent. So you can see there's lots of things here where there's no real blip. The bee doesn't recognize those compounds. It doesn't have the receptors for those. But you can see a couple where every single time the bee recognized it. These are probably the ones that are important to bring the bee into those flowers. So you'll recognize this one. This is that beta-ocimene I showed you earlier. It's really common in a lot of flowers. I'm going to guess that a lot of different kinds of bees recognize that. Noninal, to me, if you smell it in a little vial, it smells a little like when you stand behind Burger King, that sort of oil Fried smell? It smells like fried food. It's straight. Methyl salicylate is the smell of like wintergreen. It's a minty smell. And then this one is a really common compound. The farnesene and some of the other compounds that come out way down here have been found in other studies to be important to bees in terms of recognizing their flowers. So it's not enough that I just looked at, and you'll notice the bee that specializes on the cactus is able to recognize the same compounds that are in the mallow. So they're cueing into the same things. I also compared it to a non-host. Can it recognize compounds that come out in a flower that it doesn't like to visit? And so in this case, this is the prickly pear, or the prickly poppy again. These are the two compounds that give it that scent that's very much like, smells like Christmas to me, nutmeg and allspice. And the bee is able to recognize those compounds as well. So it's able to recognize things that aren't in its host plant too. That doesn't mean it likes them though. So the next step then, I'll show you what, these are the names for them. The next step was to head outside and see if I could manipulate bees and figure out if they were really turned off by these compounds like I thought they were. The first thing I tried was we built this cage and we put little flowers in there, and here's my beer bottle from the night before with little flowers in it. And we would sit inside and try and get bees to visit our flowers so we could figure out what was going on. Those bees refused to cooperate. Every single bee that we put in there would fly to the top and hit itself on the ceiling until it died rather than visit a flower inside an enclosure. They refused to cooperate. So we stopped. We didn't do that. Next we tried painting the antenna with a compound that's used by surgeons to deaden nerve endings to sort of plug the nose of the bee to see if we could separate the visual versus the chemical cues for these bees. So we painted the antenna with this. And I got this idea from another bee study where apparently it worked, but my bees refused to cooperate and spent the whole time trying to scrape it off and wouldn't participate. So then I tried the old classic, the Y tube, where you put the bee down here and you give it a choice. In here you blow the scent, and there I have my little mallow flowers in there. And over here there's nothing. So it chooses, can it choose just based on scent between a mallow, go left or right depending. And they, again, refused to walk down the tube and pick a flower. That's all they needed to do. So finally I compromised and I set up arrays of flowers and I recorded how many times the bee visited them for 15 minutes. And then I literally took the chemical methyl salicylate or nonanal or trans-beta-osamine and put it on the flower to see if I could change the scent of the flower and whether that changed visitation rates. And I found that when I added a compound that already occurred in the host flower, the bees didn't care. They still visited the flowers at the same rate. There was no big change in visitation. And that was true for both of them. But when I added a compound that was not normally present in there, something that was foreign to them, they stopped visiting the flowers. So when the scent of the flower changed, they were no longer interested in it. And this is linalool is common in perfumes. It's what gives jasmine its lovely scent. And my bees don't like it at all. So my conclusions is that Diadasia are a little bit like my 4-year-old. They prefer really bland foods that don't have a lot of smell. Anytime you add one of the compounds that makes most of our flowers smell really, really nice, the bees stop visiting. This is kind of interesting because it's different than what other studies have found, where they found that there's some special molecule that is in a flower and causes the bees to come and visit. In my case, it seems to be different, which is great. This is really interesting. It suggests that specialization is evolving in a lot of different ways and that there's a lot of different stories to tell here. So what does this mean for you? I mean, this is kind of a weird random little PhD study. What does this mean for your garden, and how can you use this information to kind of attract bees? I would say that it's very similar to feeding a toddler, actually. If you look at a website that tells you how to make sure your toddler is feeding well, you'll notice that it says the toddler years are for exploring. The best thing you can do is offer your toddler a variety of foods. from each food group with different tastes, textures, and colors. And I would say the same is true for attracting bees to your yard. If you want to see bees in your yard, first of all, I want you to know that they're already there. All of the bees that I collected in here, you can see in your gardens right now. They're out in abundance, and we could go out and collect them together. Once you know that these bees are there, it's much more evident, much easier to find them. I would say take a cup of coffee, go stand near your biggest flower patch in your yard, and don't move. Keep your shadow off the plant and wait, and they will come in. They'll be there. Green ones and blue ones. I caught a red bee yesterday that was gorgeous. As far as habitat for them, you can either provide them with a home or leave the homes that are already there. I suggest maybe limiting the use of weed barrier because quite often that prevents those ground nesting bees from either coming up if they're below it or being able to nest underneath. You leave behind old logs if you have them. If you have plant stems, Spiralcia and all of these other ones that you cut down at the end of the year, just recognize those might be homes for some of the twig nesting bees. Maybe don't mulch them or burn them right away. Let them wait a year before you get rid of those, just because there's probably bees nesting in those stems. You can add a bee hotel if you want. They have limited success here unless you're right next to a riparian area, just because most of our bees are ground nesters and aren't looking for that kind of home anyway. And then finally, back to the flowers. Remember that bees are out from spring all the way through fall. From now until the first hard frost, the bees are out. So you need to have flowers out for that whole period of time. And remember that there are bees that are attracted to flowers because they're bland, and there are bees that are attracted to flowers because they produce something that smells perfumey and lovely to us. So go with the diversity of colors and shapes and scents and sizes. And plant families to attract different specialists. They're specializing in different families. I encourage natives as often as possible to try and plant natives. That's what these bees have co-evolved with for a very long time. And that's what they're best able to process. And it's okay if you don't really have much. And just as a sort of a little bit hopeful, this is my mom's yard in downtown Salt Lake City, and she's surrounded by Kentucky bluegrass, maple trees, and pavement. And she planted a native Morzeric yard, and she has bees nesting in her yard, including specialists on cactus flowers. And I don't know how they found her yard, but there they are nesting in her yard. This is my co-author Joe's yard, and he has little tiny sweat bees nesting all along the base right here, right next to his front door. Here are some good options for northern New Mexico. The early blooming shrubs are great. Remember that those shrubs that bloom really early, nothing else is really going, so that's a great resource for a lot of early bees. But it's hard to go wrong with any of these plants. And there's a lot more than this probably that I could have put on here. Apache plume's actually a really good one, oddly enough. And so I'll quit right there. That's supposed to say your name, Russ, and it got cut off. But, thank you for your time. I'd be happy to answer any questions. And thank you for your Now that I've gone around you all.
Last year I had a fountain running, it was bubbling, and the bees just lined up around it. Unfortunately, it didn't survive through, I should have taken it in, it didn't last. So it seemed to me like before that year, I just put a plain old bird out there, and they didn't line up as much as they did with the water bubbling.
I don't think the running water necessarily has, the thing I'm wondering if it had more to do with the fact that it was a pretty dry year, and there was probably less water sources elsewhere. And that might have been it. I've never experienced running water. Most of them prefer the still water.
Oh, okay.
But interestingly, the only bees that really go to those are the honeybees because they need the water in order to make honey. That's part of it. And sometimes the mason bees will get a little drop of water to help with the mud that they use to create walls.
So it's okay to put that out? Right?
It's fine to put it out, yeah.
Okay.
Most of what you'll get, I think, is going to be the honeybees. Right. Totally fine. Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to share that my property, my house, I have periwinkle and Russian sage, and the bees are there constantly, all day, morning until
Yeah.
night, and they love it. And so
Russian
if anybody
sages,
wants
yeah.
some sage or curry, we can come see me.
No thanks.
Sage?
Russian sage. Russians
Oh,
love
yeah,
sage.
that's true. So she did say that.
So, I've read some articles about your work here in Taos County on the monument, and if I recall correctly, you found, like, between, like, the uplands and riparian areas, that riparian areas have more diversity?
Yes, so the study isn't complete, so I can't say that that's the whole story, but definitely in the drier year that was last year, our standardized plot where we sampled in the same way every time, we got a lot more diversity there than we did in the upland areas. And I'm guessing that has a lot to do with the fact that even in a dry year, the riparian areas still had pretty good bloom. Whereas in the upland sites, a lot of flowers chose not to really come out. And interestingly, bees can do the same thing. So if it's a really dry year, a lot of the bees will do something called vet hedging, where they've reached maturity in the spring and they're waiting for the right cues from the soil in terms of temperature or moisture or something, who knows for sure. And if they don't get those cues, they can make the decision to stay in the ground for a whole nother year until conditions are better. And they found bees that can do that for up to 7 years, waiting in the ground for a good year. So those bees may have just waited until a better year before they came up in those numbers. I don't know for sure. I'm excited to find out.
So I know flowers do that too, out in the
Yep.
desert. So
Yep.
Is there a correlation if the bee's a specialist on a certain species of flower and that flower hedges its bets during a certain year, will the bee also?
I don't think so. So the question was, if a bee specializes on a flower and the flower chooses not to come up because it's a dry year, because flowers can do that too, does the specialist make a choice that mirrors that, so that they're both hedging their bets at the same time in the same way? Most of the specialist bees in desert areas, and I don't know if this is true in other areas, but in desert areas, most of the bees, plants that have specialist bees on them, are perennial and they bloom regardless. And I kind of wonder if that's not an adaptation on the part of the specialist to pick a plant that's guaranteed to come up even in a bad year. So almost the opposite of following it, they pick the plants that are more guaranteed. Usually widespread, so globe mallow, rabbit brush, a lot of the things in the Asteraceae. What's another really? Cactus. Cactus has a lot of specialists on it. And these are things that even in bad years, at least some blooms happen.
You didn't mention how to distinguish a fly from a bee.
I did not, yes. I've talked to this crowd before and I didn't want to repeat too much, so I left that part out. So the way that you tell a bee from a fly is a couple things. First of all, what did I say bees use to smell flowers? They have much longer antennae. Fly antennae are short, stubby little things that come out right in the front of the face, and they're tiny. Flies are in the order Diptera. Di means two, and ptera means wings. So they have 2 wings, one on either side of the body. The second set of wings has become these tiny little nubbins called halteres, and they use them to flip upside down and land on the ceiling. But flies only have 2 wings, bees have 4, and you can often see in the way that a bee lands on a flower, the 4 wings are more obvious. Bees, all female bees anyway, collect pollen, so they tend to have pollen collecting hairs, those big stout ones, either on their hind legs or on the underside of their bellies. And you can see that even in this picture here, you can see the hairs underneath here. Bees in general are hairier than flies. Not all the time there are hairy flies, and there are bees that don't have much hair. But overall, on the whole, bees tend to be hairier. And then if you look at this, I think it's pretty obvious that these guys are really cute, whereas flies are...
Yeah, but they still can have bands. The flies can still
Why do flies and bees look so much
Yeah,
alike?
yeah.
The fly mimics the bees in a lot of cases because the bee stings. And if you can look that way without having to evolve a sting, you're less likely to be eaten.
There's another question.
Sure.
How recent from there was a slide that said bees have been around between, that was a big time gap, somewhere 60 million to 100 and something million. Well, why the uncertainty?
So that slide was referring to how long we think flowers and bees have been co-evolving together, not when the first bee or when the first flower showed up. So the first flower fossils, like true flower with the ball of pollen and stuff in the center, I think is like 100, 120 million years ago, something like that.
Okay, yeah.
And they may have been around before that, we're not really sure. And then the first bee fossil is about, what is it? Maybe 80 million years ago, something like that. And it's in amber, and we know it's a bee because it has pollen collecting hairs and all these other things.
Cretaceous.
Yeah, yep. So the flowers came first, the bees weren't too far behind. And it's thought that that flower probably was a great place for a wasp to find a meal. And that meal would have been dusted with the pollen from the flower, and it developed a preference for the pollen over the actual meat that it was there for. She was waiting a little longer, so we'll go here.
Now, not all bees sting though, is that right?
Only female bees sting. So the sting is a modified ovipositor. The ovipositor is what lays the eggs, and since the females lay the eggs, they're the ones that have that.
So all
It's
varieties.
It's been modified to the point that it no longer functions as an ovipositor. It's just the sting now. But
Was that just honeybees?
no, all bees.
The native bees?
All bees, yes. The difference between the honeybee and the native bee is that the honeybee stings once and loses the sting in your skin and dies. Whereas native bees, imagine if you're the mother and if you were to sting and die, you've kind of defeated your lineage and all lineages to come. So they can sting you multiple times. They don't lose their stinger when they sting. It doesn't hurt as bad. I was stung. I was helping my daughter go potty outside the other day, and I had 4 bees in my net and was trying to help her balance. And that dang bee stung me 4 times, and it itched for a little bit, and then it was done. It's not nearly as bad as the honeybee.
Do honeybees act as competitors for native bees and resulting in a lot of loss?
Great question. There is mounting evidence that yes, they do. And this isn't in all cases, but in areas where floral resources are pretty scarce, right, where the bees were probably already on the edge of competing with each other, when you add in, millions and millions of honeybees who tend to be a little more aggressive on the flowers and who are cooperating in the sense of bringing all of that pollen back to the nest, there is reason to believe that they actually can pretty significantly impact native bees. Now, in an area where there's plenty of flowers to go around, it probably doesn't matter at all, but in deserts, probably does. Yeah. Good question.
Do the males live, how long do they live? The females they emerge, they mate, they feed and lay eggs over several weeks. So they'll...
6 to 9 weeks was the average that I found in my studying Grand Staircase, where I could average over several years to really get a handle on that.
And the males, how long?
About the same.
Same.
About the same.
And all they do, they just go, they mate.
That's it. That's all they do.
They don't have to feed the babies.
Nope.
Okay.
They just
And is there any
defend
idea,
a territory. They'll find a territory and try and
any idea of how many eggs a female lays?
Depends a lot on the bee. So I've read studies where the bee will lay up to 60, and then other studies with other bees where it's maybe 6 or 8.
And it's like, wow.
I was in Mexico in the Yucatan Peninsula, and there is some native bees there that produce honey, but like a very, very small amount. It's way more medicinal, and then also stingless bees.
Yeah.
Is there a lot of more regional native bees that also produce honey, but maybe in a different?
Yeah. So there's even bumblebees produce almost a kind of honey, but it's not for overwintering, so it's a little bit different. As you head to more tropical environments, there are other bees that produce honey as well, just not here in North America. And it's not all like the honeybee. Even, so honeybee, Apis mellifera, there's 6 or 7 other species in that same genus, Apis, and not all of them even produce honey as well as Apis mellifera.
I don't know how to formulate this question, but you read often about bees and colonies that are dying because of maybe insecticides, maybe this, maybe that.
Yeah.
Do you have any update on any of that?
I don't have an update. So when people talk about bee declines, it's a hard thing to wrap your mind around when you think about the fact that there are 4,000 different bees. When we say bee, it's almost like saying mammal decline. You're grouping so many things together in one group, it's impossible to really say anything meaningful in that sense. As far as when you said hives, we're probably talking about the honeybee. And the things that impact the honeybee are pretty different from what impact our native bees. That's more like landscape level changes, habitat modification, honeybees, things like that are probably impacting the native solitary ones. And we don't really know as far as they're concerned because no one sampled Taos County prior to 3 years ago. So everything I'm finding kind of makes it look like the bee populations are growing. We have centers here and we didn't before, so they must be increasing in abundance. So we don't have that baseline to really know for the native solitary bees, which is a little tricky. For honeybees and most of the bumblebees, we have a better handle on it. And the things that are impacting the honeybee most dramatically is the varroa mite is kind of a big deal. The varroa mite made it to North America in the 1980s, I think. It started in Russia, made its way slowly around the world up through South America.
That's the fungus.
No, mite, varroa
Oh, mite,
It's a little mite.
okay.
And they had a pretty dramatic impact on the bees. There's some thought that insecticides or other pesticides and things may be impacting honeybees, but it's hard to get an answer since it's hard to do inside an enclosed space. So when an answer comes out, there's usually differing opinions on how well the study was done, even among scientists. So we don't yet have a solid answer. It seems like in some cases they might make it harder for the bees to find their way back to the nest and they move slower. Maybe they don't make as many offspring. But the issues affecting the honeybee are probably pretty different from what are impacting our native bees. That seems like I gave you a lot of information without actually answering your question. I'm not sure.
You can't. When you're looking for these bee nests, like when you're outside, I feel like any hole you'd be like, is that a bee nest?
Yeah.
Are there certain like keen things that you start noticing like, okay, that's probably one, that's probably not, or you get a lot of dead ends? Great question.
Yeah. The best way is to stand there and wait for a bee to go in it. I can't tell you how many little ant mounds I have stared at and been like, this is it, I know this is one
Really?
little ant comes out. It's not.
Yeah.
Other than that, if you find them in an aggregation where there's a whole bunch together, chances are good that's
Okay.
bees. And in the case of like the diadasia, the mallow and cactus bees that I study, they usually have these cute little chimneys, these little turrets
Right.
over the top, and there's no question what that is. When you see those, you know what they are.
Cool. It's a shame.
Oh, and in like wood, you can often tell it's a bee because it'll be sealed at the end with a bit of leaf material or a bit of mud, and that's usually pretty obvious to me that a bee was affected.
Cool. Do the females spend the night in the nest, in the ground?
Most of the time, the females spend the night in their nests.
Okay. And you said that you don't
You
have
wanna
to
see
get
where
up
the
at the
males-
crack of dawn to go bee hunting. They don't
No.
get active until it warms up.
That's a male.
So you can
They
sleep
sleep inside flowers at night. This was at about 7 p.m. In my garden, I had a globe mallow, and the bees, all of the little flowers had bees curled up inside, sleeping. Male bees. And your squash flowers, if you squeeze your squash flowers, the ones that have wilted and are kind of curled over, at night, squeeze them. And you'll probably hear them buzz back at you. That's the male bee sleeping inside.
Do they sleep in there just because it's a safe spot, right?
Some of them, I have pictures in the book, come see me and I'll show you, but they'll nest in like conglomerations on the end of a grass stem all together. Yeah, grab onto a grass stem and just all hang out together. And the bachelor pet.
Did you really mention that, you can over mulch an area? You want to leave bare ground for the bees, because they're not going to build their nest by digging under mulch. So bare ground is good excuse here. And it's easy to leave bare ground here, right?
They do like that hard packed stuff
Yeah.
quite a bit. Some like sand, there's a bee for every soil substrate you can think of, but I would say on the whole, hard packed earth seems to be a favorite of a lot of species. Did you ever hear that?
Making a colony is an ant thing, but they're really closely related to bees, but only the honeybee makes a colony.
No, well, the bumblebees do.
Oh.
Stingless bees do. There's quite a few bees around the world that do that, as well as wasps, as well as a number of ants. So within the Cuneiform class order Hymenoptera, there are quite a few that make colonies. There's a whole book on it that's really cool by, what's his name? Hold
Wilson?
on, you guys will. E.O. Wilson, that's it. And he talks about the evolution of those colonies. Two more, go ahead.
So you had a slide earlier on where there was this fellow that was just digging
Oh,
like there
man.
was no tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then you showed that you could go quite deep to see this nesting tunnel. Well, I mean, they must not be very fragile if you can dig around it and get down there. I mean, I just can't imagine that they're sturdy enough that you can get down and then sort of see them.
Yes.
Well, so like I just said, a lot of these bees like hard-packed earth, right? So
Yeah.
then it's pretty easy to chip down next to them.
Okay.
And yeah, sometimes they'll collapse and you can take a little paintbrush and paint them back out and get it, you know,
Gosh, it just seems
restored,
like
so
such
to
a
speak.
delicate little thing to be able to do down
It
and
is
find.
delicate and it's super fun to do, actually. It's fun to be that delicate and try and, you know, not destroy it and get down and see.
So they pack the dirt, they don't remove it. How does-
It depends on the bee. Some of them push it all the way back out, which gives that gopher mound appearance.
But not 9 feet.
Oh, so in the case of those, I think I remember this right. So here's the main tunnel, and successive generations had used different layers. So rather than pack it all the way out, they would pack it into old tunnels that weren't used anymore.
I see,
Pretty sure I remember that right. Yeah.
Does elevation make a difference with the bees? Because I'm like at almost 9,000 feet
Okay.
elevation. Can't say that I've seen a bee, but I have seen the daisies, so I'm just wondering.
Yes, elevation does impact bees. As you move up in elevation, the flowering season is shorter, so there's usually less diversity at higher elevations.
Yeah.
And the bees that can handle the cold are fewer. So Andrina, the mining bee, do I have a picture? No, that's not. The mining bees do quite well at higher elevations, so you've probably got those up there. Bumblebees do great, they don't mind. A lot of mason bees do okay at higher elevations, and then there's a relative of mason bees called, I don't think it has a common name, Hoplites is the genus. And they're probably up in your neck of the woods as well. What's interesting actually is these guys are in the sweat bee family, and they found that depending on the elevation, they may approach being social and having colonies. They're almost colonial bees at lower elevations, and at higher elevations are solitary. It's kind of fascinating. But they can occur at a pretty good range. 9,000, you definitely have fewer bees up there, but you definitely still have bees.
Well, thank you, Olivia.
Yeah.